The air in the Park family's grand dining hall is thick with the scent of expensive incense and even more expensive cruelty. Park Jae-yoon leans back in his velvet-lined chair, a smirk playing on his lips as he prepares to deliver a final, crushing insult to the woman standing near the door. But before the words can leave his throat, a voice cuts through the room, not the voice of a man, but one with the crystalline, terrifying clarity of a child. Standing at the threshold is Seon-ho. He is barely 6 years old, but he stands with a spine so straight it seems forged from iron. The overhead chandeliers catch the planes of his face, revealing the unmistakable Park aristocratic brow and a jawline that is a mirror image of the portraits lining the hallway. The adults freeze. The impossible truth hangs in the air. This boy is undeniably of their blood, yet he looks at them with the cold assessment of a king surveying a group of peasants. "You are speaking about my mother," Seon-ho says, his voice small but carrying a weight that makes the wine glasses on the table vibrate. "In my father's house, we do not tolerate cowards. Apologize, or I will have the guards remove you." The shock is a physical force. Jae-yoon's face turns a mottled purple. He had spent years branding his ex-wife a temporary mistake, a woman he had erased from the family records. Now, a child who carries his family's legacy more purely than he ever did is ordering him out of his own ancestral home. The return of the new queen, the power shift. Just as Jae-yoon rises to lash out at the boy, a figure steps from the shadows of the foyer. Obioma enters the room, and the breath leaves the lungs of everyone present. 8 years ago, she had been thrown out of this house in the rain, penniless and broken. Today, she is the definition of sophisticated justice. She wears a structured, cream-colored blazer that radiates success, her natural afro framing a face that is no longer clouded by fear, but illuminated by a quiet, lethal dignity. She doesn't speak to Jae-yoon. She doesn't have to. Following close behind her is the man the family feared most, Park Do-hyeon. He is the exiled shadower, taller and broader than Jae-yoon, moving with a liquid grace that suggests a predator in a suit. He places a hand on the small of Obioma's back, a gesture of total possession and protection. The final blow comes from the head of the table. The 92-year-old patriarch, Park Musang, sharp as broken glass despite his wheelchair, wraps his cane on the marble floor. "Sit down, Jae-yoon," he rests. "I invited them. It's time you met the woman who rebuilt what you tried to destroy." "Wait, besties, did you see that? The man they exiled is back. And he's not just here for dinner, he's here for the deed to the house." Please drop a comment. Is Jae-yoon about to lose everything? Hit that subscribe button, because we're going back to the night this all began, when Obioma was left for dead in the rain. The sky over Seoul didn't just rain that night. It mourned. The downpour was a relentless, icy shroud that turned the neon lights of the city into blurry, bleeding stains against the pavement. Outside the iron gates of the Park estate, the world was cold, but inside the foyer, the air was freezing for a different reason. Obioma stood trembling, not from the cold, but from the sheer weight of the betrayal. She was for months pregnant, a fact she had only discovered weeks prior. Yet the life growing inside her felt like the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth. Across from her, Park Jae-yoon wouldn't even look her in the eye. He stood behind his mother, Seo-yeon, who held Obioma's single suitcase like it was infected with a plague. "You were a mistake." Obioma Seo-yeon's voice was like the snap of dry kindling, a distraction Jae-yoon used to annoy us. "But the game is over. The missing funds from the trust have been traced to accounts in your name. We have the proof. You can leave quietly, or you can leave in handcuffs." Obioma's breath hitched. The proof was a fabrication, a digital trail of breadcrumbs Jae-yoon had laid to cover his own gambling debts. She looked at her husband, the man who had promised her at UCLA that his family's prejudice didn't matter, that he would be her shield. "Jae-yoon," she whispered, her voice cracking. Tell them I don't even have access to those accounts. Tell them we're having a baby." Jae-yoon flinched, his jaw tightening, but he remained a shadow behind his mother's shoulder. When he finally spoke, the words were a death sentence. "My mother is right. You never fit in here. You were always looking for a way to take what wasn't yours. Just ... Go, Obioma. Don't make this harder." The betrayal hit her harder than any physical blow. He wasn't just letting them throw her out. He was participating in her execution. With a sharp shove, Sirian pushed the suitcase toward the door. It skidded across the marble, stopping at Obioma's feet. "Get out," Sirian commanded. "And if you ever mention the park name again, we will ensure you spend the rest of your life in a cell." Two security guards stepped forward, their faces expressionless masks. They took Obioma by the arms, dragging her toward the grand entrance. She didn't fight. She couldn't. Her body felt hollow, her spirit extinguished. The heavy oak doors swung open, revealing the black, watery abyss of the storm. They thrust her out, and the suitcase followed, bursting open on the wet gravel. Obioma fell to her knees. The rain soaked through her thin coat in seconds, chilling her to the bone. She scrambled to gather the few belongings that hadn't been ruined, a few clothes, a photograph of her parents, and the ultrasound picture she had tucked into her wallet. She walked to the gates, her shoes squelching in the mud. When she reached the edge of the property, she turned back. The mansion sat on the hill like a crown of thorns, its windows glowing with a warmth she was no longer allowed to touch. She felt the faint, fluttery pulse of the life inside her, a tiny heartbeat against the thundering rain. "They think they've erased us," she whispered into the wind, her fingers clenching into the wet earth. "But we are the only real thing they ever had." She had no money. Her bank accounts had been frozen by the family's lawyers. Her phone was dead. She began to walk, each step a victory over the urge to simply lie down and let the cold take her. She was a woman of the diaspora, a daughter of survivors. And though the parks had stripped her of her name and her home, they could not strip her of the fire in her blood. As she reached the main road, the headlights of a passing car caught the silver of her tears. She didn't wave it down. She just kept walking, a solitary shadow against the ashes of her old life, moving toward a future that was, for the first time, entirely her own. She was penniless, yes. She was alone, yes. But as the gates of the park estate vanished into the mist behind her, Obioma realized that for the first time in 18 months, she could finally breathe. The rain continued to fall, washing away the scent of expensive incense and the stain of Park Jae-yoon's lies. By the time the sun rose over Seoul, Obioma would be gone, a ghost in their machines, waiting for the day she would return not as a victim, but as the reckoning they never saw coming. The cold had moved past her skin and settled deep into her marrow. Obioma sat huddled on a narrow metal bench, beneath the rusted plexiglass of a bus stop, miles away from the gilded cages of the park estate. Her soaked clothes clung to her like a second, suffocating skin, and her breath hitched in shallow, jagged rhythms. She cradled her stomach with one hand, a silent promise to the life within that the shivering would eventually stop. Behind her, the city of Seoul roared with the indifference of 10 million souls. But here, under the flickering fluorescent light of the shelter, she felt like the last person on earth. The suitcase beside her was a mangled wreck of zippers and wet fabric. She reached inside, her fingers brushing against her wallet. Empty. No cards, no cash. Only the ultrasound photo that remained miraculously dry in its plastic sleeve. She pulled it out, staring at the grainy image of the tiny life that had cost her everything. A sob threatened to break through her throat, but she swallowed it down. If she started crying now, she feared the rain would never stop. A low, smooth hum vibrated through the pavement, different from the rattling engines of the city buses. A sleek black sedan, looking more like a shadow than a machine, glided to the curb. It didn't belong in this neighborhood of cramped alleyways and neon-lit convenience stores. The window rolled down with a soft hiss, revealing a man whose presence seemed to command the very air around him. Obioma tensed, her hand tightening around the handle of her suitcase. She expected more of Jae-yoon's lawyers, or perhaps the police coming to finish the job Sirian had started. But the man who stepped out of the car wasn't a servant. He was taller than Jae-yoon, broader, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of obsidian, sharp, refined, and dangerously beautiful. He didn't carry an umbrella. He simply stood in the downpour, his black wool coat soaking up the water as he watched her with eyes that burned with an unsettling intensity. "You're a long way from the hill, Obioma," he said. His voice was a deep baritone, carrying a cadence of authority that made her heart skip a beat. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a fragile thread. "If you're here to take the suitcase, take it. There's nothing left but wet clothes." The man took a step closer, his gaze falling on her hand, which was still protectively covering her womb. I'm not here for your suitcase. And I'm certainly not here on behalf of my brother. He doesn't have the stomach for a night like this. Obioma's eyes widened. Brother, you're Do-hyun, the exiled heir. The son the park spoke of only in hushed, fearful whispers. The one who had walked away, -1 years ago and built a shadow empire that rivaled the family's own. He stood before her now, a ghost made of flesh and expensive fabric. I watched them drag you out, Do-hyun said, his expression unreadable. I stood at the edge of the woods and watched my brother play the coward, while my mother played the executioner. I waited to see if you would beg. I waited to see if you would crawl back to the gate and ask for mercy. Obioma lifted her chin, her eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp fire that cut through the exhaustion. I would rather die in this rain than beg for a crumb of their mercy. A slow, devastating smile touched Do-hyun's lips. It wasn't a smile of pity. It was a smile of recognition. Good. Mercy is for the weak. Resilience is for the elite. He reached into his coat and pulled out a simple, matte black business card. He didn't hand it to her. He placed it on the bench beside her suitcase. I don't offer charity, Obioma. Charity creates debt, and debt creates chains. I am offering you an escape. Obioma looked at the card, then back at him. Why? You don't even know me. I know you better than you think. I know you spent 18 months trying to survive a family of vipers without losing your soul. I know you've been framed for a crime that would have broken a lesser woman. And I know, he paused, his eyes dropping briefly to her stomach, that you have a reason to want the parks to burn as much as I do. He stepped back toward the car, the rain cascading off his shoulders. I have a gallery in Beverly Hills that needs a curator with an eye for truth. I have a legal team that can make those frozen accounts disappear and reappear where they belong. I don't want your gratitude. I want your talent. Work for me. Build a light so brilliant that it blinds them every time they look toward the west. And if I say no, then the bus will be here in 10 minutes, he said calmly, his hand on the car door. And you can spend the rest of your life being the woman they destroyed. The choice is yours. But I think we both know you weren't born to be a victim. He slid back into the car, and the black sedan pulled away, leaving nothing but the card and the scent of rain-soaked ozone. Obioma picked up the card. It didn't have a company logo, just a name and a number in silver foil. She looked at the ultrasound photo one last time, then at the dark road ahead. The bus appeared in the distance, its headlights cutting through the mist. But as it slowed to a stop, Obioma didn't stand up. She watched the doors open and close, watched the bus pull away until its taillights were nothing but pinpricks of red in the dark. She reached for her suitcase, her fingers trembling but her mind suddenly, terrifyingly clear. She wasn't going to a shelter. She wasn't going back to the gates. She looked at the card in her hand and felt the first spark of a cold, calculated ambition. Do-hyun, she whispered, the name of Ao. The rain continued to fall on Seoul, but for Obioma, the storm had finally broken. She stood up from the bench, not as a discarded ex-wife, but as a woman who had just been handed the keys to an empire. The transition from the rain-slicked streets of Seoul to the sun-drenched hills of California was more than a change in geography. It was a shedding of skin. Under the quiet, ironclad protection of Do-hyun, Obioma didn't just survive, she began to cultivate a version of herself that was weaponized by intellect and grace. In the early years, the work was grueling. While the Park family in Korea believed she had vanished into the desperate statistics of the world, Obioma was sitting in mahogany libraries and high-rise offices, rebuilding her mind. She took on a pseudonym, Onyxbell, a name that sounded like the strike of a hammer against stone. Under this shadow identity, she completed her advanced degrees with a ferocity that stunned her professors. She didn't just study art history and international finance. She studied them as one might study a map of an enemy's fortress. She learned where the money was hidden, how reputations were manufactured, and how a single well-placed investment could topple a legacy. Do-hyun remained the silent architect of her freedom. He was never the hero who stepped in to do the work for her. Instead, he was the strategist who provided the whetstone for her blade. Their meetings, initially professional and guarded, began to shift beneath the weight of shared silences and mutual respect. They would sit in his minimalist Beverly Hills study, surrounded by the scent of old books and expensive espresso, poring over market trends or discussing the acquisition of a rare piece of African sculpture. It was during these late-night sessions that the ice between them truly began to thaw. One evening, as a warm Santana wind rattled the eucalyptus trees outside, Du Hyen watched her as she meticulously organized a portfolio for a new boutique gallery she was launching. He saw the way she tucked a stray coil of her afro behind her ear, her eyes sharp with a focus that had nothing to do with the woman he had found at that bus stop. "You're doing more than building a business, Onyx," he said softly, using the name that had become her shield. Obioma didn't look up, but her hand stilled over the papers. "I'm building a world where Seonho never has to apologize for his existence. I'm building a wall so high that your brother's shadow can never reach him." Du Hyen stood and walked toward her, his movements possessing that liquid, predatory grace. He stopped just behind her, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "You've already succeeded. The Parks think you're a ghost. They have no idea that the woman currently outmaneuvering their luxury retail partners in Europe is the same woman they threw out in the rain." Obioma finally turned to face him. The tension in the room was no longer about business or revenge. It was the gravity of two celestial bodies finally pulled into the same orbit. "Why did you really help me, Du Hyen?" It wasn't just to spite Jae-yoon. He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw, the same jawline his son would one day inherit. "I helped you because I recognized the fire. Most people are extinguished by the Parks. You used their hate as fuel. I wanted to see how bright you could burn." The kiss that followed was a quiet explosion, a culmination of years of restrained longing and unspoken understanding. It was the start of a secret renaissance of the heart. For the next 5 years, they lived a double life. To the world, Obioma was Onyx Bell, the mysterious powerhouse curator and venture capitalist who was a fixture in the upper echelons of the art and tech worlds. To Du Hyen, she was the anchor of his life, the mother of his growing son, and the only person who saw the man behind the billionaire's armor. They carved out a private sanctuary in a sprawling estate hidden by lush greenery. Here, Seonho grew up in a world of multilingual books, diverse art, and the unwavering love of a father who treated his mother like a queen. In this house, there were no temporary mistakes. There was only the steady building of an empire that would one day demand an accounting. Obioma's business, the Bell Collective, grew into a multi-billion-dollar international firm. She specialized in distressed assets, ironically, the very things the Park family excelled at creating. She was quietly buying up the debt of their suppliers, securing the land beneath their factories, and positioning herself so that when the time was right, she wouldn't just be a voice at their table, she would own the table itself. The love between Obioma and Du Hyen became the foundation of her strength. Every time she felt the old ghosts of soul whispering that she wasn't enough, she would look at Du Hyen's unwavering eyes and remember the bus stop. She was no longer the girl in the rain. She was the storm. And as the news of the elder Park patriarch's failing health began to ripple through the international wires, Obioma knew the time for secrets was coming to an end. The renaissance was complete. The reckoning was next. The hospital room was a silent fortress of glass and moonlight, perched high above the glowing arteries of Los Angeles. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of sterile linens and the sweet, primal musk of no life. Obioma lay against the pillows, her skin glowing with a thin sheen of exhaustion, her breath finally slowing into a rhythmic peace. In her arms, wrapped in a blanket of organic Pima cotton, was a miracle that felt like the ultimate act of defiance. He was tiny, yet he possessed a presence that seemed to fill every corner of the room. His skin was a beautiful, warm hue, the color of rich earth meeting golden sand, and his head was covered in a soft, dark down of curls. But it was his face that stole the breath from the room. Even in the vulnerability of infancy, he bore the unmistakable, sharp bone structure of the Park lineage. He had the aristocratic brow and the refined, decisive jawline that had marked a dynasty for a century. Du Hyen stood by the window, his silhouette a dark pillar against the city lights. He had been silent for an hour, his eyes fixed on the horizon, but his heart was anchored to the bed. When he finally turned, his expression was a raw, devastating mix of reverence and a protective fury so cold it was almost holy. He walked to the bedside with that liquid, kingly grace, looking down at the child who was both a bridge and a fortress. He looks like us. Obioma whispered, her voice a soft rasp. She looked down at her son, seeing the features that had once been used as weapons against her, now transformed into a badge of survival. He looks like the people who tried to destroy me. Du Haiyan reached down, his large, calloused hand moving with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man of his power. He let the infant's tiny, translucent fingers curl around his thumb. The contact was electric, a silent passing of a mantle. He carries their blood, Du Haiyan said, his voice dropping into a low, vibrato rumble. But he will never carry their poison. He has the Park face, but he has your heart, Obioma. That makes him more than a prince. It makes him a king. He sat on the edge of the bed, his gaze never leaving the boy. In that moment, the shadow heir looked less like a businessman and more like a sentinel. The memories of his own childhood, the cold dinners, the conditional love, the blatant bigotry of the main house in Seoul flashed through his mind like shards of glass. He remembered the way his father, Musang, had tested his sons like products on a line, and the way Jae-yoon had folded under the weight of his own cowardice. I swear to you, Du Haiyan murmured, his eyes burning with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. He will never know the shadow of that house. He will never hear the word mistake. He will never see a door closed to him because of the beautiful skin he inherited from you.
I will build a world so vast and so secure that the main house will look like a hovel in comparison. Obioma reached out, her hand resting on Du Haiyan's arm. She felt the cold tension in his muscles. The silent vow he was making to the universe. We'll build it together, she said. He won't just be protected from them. He will be the reason they realize they've lost. Du Haiyan leaned down, pressing a lingering kiss to Obioma's forehead before leaning lower to touch his lips to the infant's brow. Welcome, Park Seon-ho, he whispered. Your name means goodness and light, and I will spend every breath of my life ensuring that no shadow ever touches you. As the dawn began to break over the Pacific, painting the room in shades of violet and rose, the three of them sat in the quiet of their new reality. The world outside still thought Obioma was a ghost and Du Haiyan was a traitor, but inside this room, a new dynasty had been born. Seon-ho slept on, unaware that he was the living embodiment of a reckoning, a child born of a love that had survived the fire, destined to inherit a kingdom that would never be built on lies. The Park family in Seoul was celebrating its heritage that night, oblivious to the fact that their true heir had just arrived not in a palace of stone, but in a sanctuary of truth. The king was here, and the clock had finally begun to tick for those who had tried to erase his mother.
The walls of the Park family's private hospital wing were white, sterile, and suffocating, yet they couldn't mask the scent of decaying power. Park Musang, the man who had commanded an empire with a single nod for nearly 7 decades, now looked like a ghost draped in silk. The monitors pulsed with a rhythmic, mechanical indifference, a sharp contrast to the chaotic decline of the dynasty he had spent his life building. At 92, the cancer eating through his bones was less painful than the realization currently rotting his spirit. He had left his legacy in the hands of a weakling. Across from his bed, Park Jae-yoon sat with his head bowed, holding a leather-bound financial report like a shield. He was trembling. Even in his weakened state, Musang's eyes were sharp as broken glass, and they were currently cutting right through his youngest son's desperate lies. 30 million, Jae-yoon. Musang's voice was a jagged rasp, a sound like dry leaves skittering over a tombstone. You thought I wouldn't notice $30 million vanishing into shell corporations in the Cayman Islands. You thought I was already dead. Father, it was an investment. The markets were volatile, Jae-yoon stammered, his face pale and slick with sweat. I was trying to protect the trust. I was. You were gambling, Musang spat, the effort causing a fit of wet, hacking coughs. He waved away the nurses who rushed forward, his eyes never leaving his son. You were gambling with the blood of our ancestors. You used the same digital backdoors you used to frame that girl 8 years ago. Did you think I didn't know? I am the one who built those doors, you fool. Jae-yoon flinched as if he'd been struck. Obioma, she was a distraction. She was the only thing in your life that was real. And you threw her to the wolves to hide your own incompetence. The patriarch whispered, his head sinking back into the pillows. I watched you do it. I allowed it because I wanted to see if you had the spine to lead. But you don't. You have the heart of a scavenger, Jae-yoon. You eat what others kill, and you hide when the wind changes. Museng closed his eyes, the weight of his regret pressing down harder than the tumor in his chest. For 15 years, he had maintained a wall of silence between himself and his eldest son, Du Haiyan. He had called Du Haiyan rebellious and insolent for refusing to engage in the family's more predatory practices. He had exiled him to the shadows of the West, convinced that the shadow heir would eventually crawl back, broken and seeking forgiveness. But the reports from his private intelligence team told a different story. While the main house was hemorrhaging money and respect under Jae-yoon's clumsy hands, Du Haiyan had built a leviathan. Chai Holdings International wasn't just a company, it was a fortress. And the woman at the center of Du Haiyan's new world, the mysterious Onyx Bell, was a name that now commanded more respect in the global markets than the park name ever had. The irony was a bitter pill. He had discarded the gold and kept the dross. He had exiled the only man capable of saving the park legacy, because that man had possessed the one thing the family lacked: integrity. "Get out," Museng commanded, his voice barely a breath. "Father, please, get out." The old man's eyes snapped open, blazing with a final, terrifying lucidity. As Jae-yoon scurried from the room, Museng reached for the vintage bell on his bedside table. He didn't ring for the doctors. He rang for his personal secretary, a man who had been with him since the days of the Korean Reconstruction. "Find him," Museng whispered as the man entered. "Find Du Haiyan. I don't care what it costs. I don't care how many bridges I have to rebuild with my own dying hands. Bring the shadow heir home. And tell him I know about the boy." The secretary paused, his eyebrows lifting slightly. "And the woman, sir?" "Obioma." Museng looked toward the window, where the sun was setting over Seoul, casting long, bloody shadows across the city. He remembered the night he had watched her being dragged out into the rain, her head held high even as the gates slammed shut. He remembered the quiet dignity he had mistaken for weakness. "Tell him to bring her too," Museng said, a single tear tracing a path through the deep canyons of his face. "I am going to die soon, and I will not go into the dark knowing I left my kingdom to a coward. I want to see the woman who rebuilt what we tried to destroy. I want to see if she has enough mercy left to forgive a dying man his pride." The search was quiet, global, and relentless. As the patriarch's health dwindled to a flicker, the wires between Seoul and Los Angeles hummed with the weight of a summons. 15 years in the making. The main house was a house of cards, and the wind was finally beginning to blow. Museng lay in the dark, listening to the hum of the machines, waiting for the only son who had been strong enough to leave him, and the woman who was coming back to take it all. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our dramatic love stories. Comment below and let's continue with this journey. The gates of the park estate groaned as they swung open, a heavy, metallic sound that echoed like a long-delayed indrawn breath. For Obioma, the gravel driveway was a road paved with ghosts. The last time she had traversed this path, she had been a shadow in the rain, her belongings spilling into the mud and her dignity under siege. Today, the sky over Seoul was a hard, brilliant blue, and the air was crisp with the scent of pine and impending change. She sat in the back of the armored sedan, her hand resting atop Du Haiyan's. She was the picture of sophisticated justice, dressed in a structured, cream-colored blazer that radiated a quiet, lethal power. Beside her, Seon-ho sat with a spine forged from iron, his small navy suit jacket pressed to perfection. He watched the passing gardens not with the wide-eyed wonder of a child, but with the cool, observant assessment of a true heir. "They think this is a funeral for your past," Du Haiyan said, his voice a low, steady rumble that anchored her. He looked out the window at the familiar stone walls of his childhood prison, his expression one of liquid grace and restrained fury. "They have no idea it's a closing ceremony for their future." As the car pulled up to the grand entrance, the family was already gathered on the steps, a tableau of arrogance and mounting anxiety. Seoyeon stood at the center, draped in somber black silks, her face a mask of practiced mourning. Jae-yoon was beside her, looking diminished, his eyes darting toward the car with a mixture of dread and a lingering, pathetic hope. They had heard that Du Haiyan was returning to answer the patriarch's summons, and they had convinced themselves that Obioma was merely a tag-along, a desperate woman clinging to the shadow heir for a second chance at the table. The chauffeur opened the door, and Du Haiyan stepped out first. He stood for a moment, his presence dwarfing the architecture of the house. Then, he reached back and offered his hand to Obioma. When she stepped onto the pavement, the silence that fell over the family was physical. Xiuyan's hand flew to her throat, and Ji-yoon went a sickly shade of gray. This was not the broken girl they had discarded. This was a woman who moved with the authority of a queen. Her voluminous afro a crown, her eyes holding a calm that was far more terrifying than anger. "You have a lot of nerves showing your face here," Xiuyan hissed, her voice trembling as Obioma approached the steps. "Du Haiyan, I can understand you coming to see your father, but to bring this woman into our home after what she did, after the shame she brought us." Obioma didn't flinch. She stopped 3 steps below Xiuyan, looking up at her with a faint, pitying smile. "Your memory is as selective as your morals, Xiuyan. I didn't bring shame to this house. I simply took my dignity with me when I left. It seems you haven't found any to replace it. How dare you?" Jae-yoon stepped forward, his voice pitching high with desperation. "You're only here because you've seduced my brother into feeling sorry for you. Are you here to beg for a portion of the inheritance? Is that it? Are you finally back for the money you tried to steal?" Du Haiyan moved then, a swift, predatory motion that placed him directly in Jae-yoon's personal space. The younger brother flinched, nearly stumbling back into the foyer. "Careful, Jae-yoon," Du Haiyan said, his voice a dangerous whisper. "You're speaking to my wife. And as for money, you should be more concerned with your own. I've spent the last 72 hours looking at the books. You haven't just been gambling with the trust. You've been gambling with the very roof over your head." "What is that supposed to mean?" Xiuyan demanded, her eyes darting between her sons. "This is the main house. It belongs to the Park Legacy. It belonged to the Park Industries Holding Group," Obioma corrected, her voice clear and resonant, carrying across the manicured lawn. "The same group that went into default 3 months ago thanks to Jae-yoon's investments. The banks were ready to seize the estate and turn it into a luxury hotel." She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a slim, gold embossed folder. She didn't hand it to them. She held it with the casual indifference of someone holding a grocery receipt. "My firm, the Bell Collective, purchased the debt in full yesterday morning," Obioma said, her eyes locking onto Jae-yoon's. The color drained from his face until he looked like a corpse in a suit. "I didn't come here to beg for a place in your home, Jae-yoon. I came here because I'm the one who bought it. Technically, you're all currently trespassing on my property." The revelation hit the family like a thunderbolt. Xiuyan's legs buckled, and she had to lean against the heavy oak door for support. Hannah, who had been lurking in the shadows of the hallway, let out a strangled cry of disbelief. They had prepared a theater of humiliation, intending to treat Obioma like a beggar at the gates, only to realize she was the one holding the keys to the kingdom. You bought the estate," Jae-yoon whispered, his voice cracking. "I bought the estate, the land, and the factory debts," Obioma said, her tone as cold as the rain that had once soaked her to the bone. "I rebuilt my life out of the ashes you left me in, and now, I've come to collect the interest on your cruelty." From behind them, Seon-ho stepped forward, standing beside his mother. He looked up at the mansion, then at the trembling Nan who was his biological father. The boy's gaze was unsettlingly mature, a cold assessment that mirrored Du Haiyan's. "Is this the place, Yuma?" Seon-ho asked, his voice carrying the crystalline clarity of the Park bloodline. "The place where the cowards live." "It was, Seon-ho," Obioma said, placing a hand on her son's shoulder. "But today, the cowards are moving out." Du Haiyan looked at his mother and brother, his expression one of absolute, devastating finality. "Father is waiting for us in the dining hall. I suggest you find some composure. You're about to meet the true heir of the Park Legacy, and for once in your lives, you are going to be silent." As they walked past the stunned, broken remnants of the family, Obioma felt the weight of 8 years finally lift. She wasn't just back in the lion's den. She was the one who had tamed the lions. The air inside the house still smelled of incense and old secrets. But as she led her son through the foyer, she knew that by sunset, the only scent left would be the truth. The air in the grand dining hall was thick with the scent of braised short ribs and expensive wine, but the atmosphere was far from celebratory. The long mahogany table, which had hosted decades of high-stakes negotiations and cold family dinners, now served as the stage for a final, desperate stand. At the head of the table, Musang sat in his wheelchair, his breathing labored but his eyes fixed on the entrance. When Obioma and Du Haiyan entered, followed by Seon-ho, the clatter of silver against porcelain died an abrupt death. The extended family, gathered like vultures sensing a change in the wind, stared in a stunned, collective silence. Jae-yoon, driven to a point of hysterical instability by the news of the estate's purchase, stood up so abruptly his chair screeched against the marble. He looked at Obioma, at her flawless, medium brown skin, her voluminous afro, and the cream blazer that cost more than his monthly allowance. The sight of her success was a mirror reflecting his own rot, and he couldn't bear the glare. "This is a farce," Jae-yoon shouted, his voice cracking with a high, jagged edge. "Father, surely you can't allow this. You invited this woman back into our ancestral home. Look at her. She doesn't belong at this table. She never did. She's a commoner from a background that has no place in the Park lineage. You're letting a person like this claim our history. A woman who brought her help and her street-smart schemes into a house of kings." He sneered, his eyes darting toward the rest of the family for support. "Is this what the Park name has come to? Mixing our blood with someone who has no legacy, no standing, just a fake name and a stolen business. She's an opportunist. A parasite who used my brother's guilt to climb out of the gutter." The room went cold. Seo-yeon looked away, sensing the shift in the air. But Jae-yoon was too blinded by his own dissent to stop. He took a step toward Obioma, his finger trembling as he pointed at her. "You are a stain on this family records, Obioma. No matter how many suits you buy or how many debts you pay, you will always be the temporary mistake I threw out into the rain. You are enough." The word wasn't shouted, but it carried a weight that made the wine glasses on the table vibrate. Du Haiyan stepped forward, moving with a liquid grace that suggested a predator finally tired of its prey. He didn't look at his father or the guests. His focus was entirely on Jae-yoon. The shadow heir seemed to grow taller, his presence expanding until the grand hall felt small. He placed a hand firmly on the small of Obioma's back, a gesture of total possession and absolute protection. "You are speaking about my mother," Seon-ho said, his small voice cutting through the tension with a crystalline authority that mimicked his father's. He stood tall beside Obioma, his dark, curly hair framing a face that was the living image of the Park ancestors on the walls. Du Haiyan's gaze turned lethal. "You are speaking to my wife, Jae-yoon, and you are speaking to the mother of the only true Park heir left in this room." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. "Wife," Seo-yeon whispered, her face turning the color of ash. "We were married in London 5 years ago," Du Haiyan said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Legally, spiritually, and in the eyes of every board of directors that matters. While you were busy branding her a mistake, I was busy making her my world. She didn't climb out of a gutter. She rose above the filth of this house. She built an empire while you were losing one. She is the sophisticated justice you've been fearing. And she did it all while raising the son you were too cowardly to claim." Du Haiyan stepped closer to Jae-yoon, who was now backed against the table, his mottled purple face twitching. "In my father's house, we do not tolerate cowards. And in my house which this now is, we do not tolerate bigots. You have insulted the woman who holds your future in her hands. You have insulted the mother of the boy who will inherit everything you wasted." He turned his head slightly toward the guards standing at the periphery. "Apologize to her now, or I will have the guards remove you from this property. And believe me, the rain tonight will be much colder than the night you threw her out." Jae-yoon looked to his mother, then to his father, searching for a lifeline. But Seo-yeon was staring at Seon-ho, her eyes wide with the realization that the boy's features were more Park than Jae-yoon's had ever been. And Musang, the patriarch, was leaning forward in his wheelchair, a ghost of a smile touching his thin lips. "He's right, Jae-yoon," the old man rasped, his cane rapping sharply against the marble. "Sit down. You've said quite enough for one lifetime. You've spent years trying to erase a masterpiece because you couldn't handle the light it cast on your own shadow." Musang looked at Obioma, his eyes sharp as broken glass but weighted with a deep, final regret. "It's time you met the woman who rebuilt what you tried to destroy. And it's time you met the boy who carries our legacy more purely than you ever did." Jae-yoon sank into his chair, his spirit visibly breaking. The lion's den had been rearranged. The predator was no longer the one with the family name. It was the woman who had survived it. Obioma looked down at the table, then up at the portraits of the men who had come before. She didn't feel the need to shout. The weight of the room had shifted, and the crown, which had been forged in the fire of her resilience, was now firmly on her head. The silence in the dining hall was no longer the silence of shock. It was the heavy, breathless quiet of a gallows. Park. Musang reached into the side of his wheelchair and pulled out a simple manila folder. It looked insignificant against the opulence of the room. Yet as he slid it across the mahogany surface toward Jae-yoon, it carried the momentum of a falling axe. You spoke of embezzlement. Jae-yoon, the patriarch rasped, his voice gaining a terrifying clarity. You spent 8 years telling the board, the family, and the press that Obioma had siphoned $50 million into offshore accounts before she fled. You used that lie to justify her exile. You used it to bury her name. Jae-yoon stared at the folder, his hands trembling so violently that the silverware near his plate rattled. Father, we've been over this. The forensic audit. The forensic audit was conducted by men you bribed with the very money you stole. Musang interrupted, the sound of his cane striking the marble floor punctuating his words like a gavel. I am a dying man, Jae-yoon. I have spent my final months looking into the dark corners of this house. I didn't hire your auditors. I hired Do Hyun's. Do Hyun stepped forward, his expression a mask of cold, liquid grace. He didn't need to speak. The ledger did the talking. Obioma stood beside him, her head held high, her presence a silent testament to the truth that had been suppressed. For nearly a decade, she watched Jae-yoon, not with the heat of vengeance, but with the cool, detached observation of a scientist watching a specimen disintegrate. Open it, Musang commanded. With trembling fingers, Jae-yoon opened the folder. Inside were bank statements from a private bank in Macau, wire transfer receipts signed with his own digital signature, and a detailed map of a shell company titled SY Holdings, his mother's initials. The blood drained from Seo-yen's face, leaving her looking like a wax figure melting under the chandelier's heat. $50 million, Musang whispered, a sound of pure, concentrated disappointment. You didn't just frame an innocent woman to hide your gambling debts. You stole from the employees' pension fund. You stole from the future of this family to pay for your cowardice at the baccarat tables. I was going to put it back. Jae-yoon suddenly erupted, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched wail. He looked around the table, pleading with aunts and uncles who were already beginning to pull away from him. The markets turned. I was trying to save us from the slump. I did what I had to do to keep the park name strong. You didn't keep the name strong, Obioma said, her voice calm and resonant, cutting through his hysteria. You turned it into a punchline. While you were hiding behind these ledgers, the people you call commoners were the ones keeping your supply lines open. You didn't just steal money, Jae-yoon. You stole the one thing a legacy cannot survive without, its honor. Musang leaned forward, his eyes sharp as broken glass fixing on his youngest son with a finality that was absolute. You are not a park. A park may be ruthless, a park may be proud, but a park does not hide behind a woman's skirts and frame her for his own filth. The patriarch turned to his legal counsel, who had been standing in the shadows of the foyer. Effective immediately, Park Jae-yoon is removed from all boards, all trusts, and all family records. He is to be stripped of his name. He will leave this house tonight with exactly what he gave Obioma 8 years ago. Nothing. Father, no. Seo-yen cried out, reaching for Musang's arm. He is your son. You can't cast him out into the street. He cast himself out the moment he lied to me. Musang spat, pulling his arm away with a strength that defied his frailty. He looked at the guards. Remove him. He is a stranger in this house. The security team, men who had taken orders from Jae-yoon for years, moved with chilling efficiency. They didn't hesitate. They took Jae-yoon by the arms, dragging him away from the table. He kicked and screamed, a hollow and dignified sound that echoed through the ancestral hall, until the heavy oak door slammed shut, cutting off his voice forever. The room returned to a deafening silence. Musang turned his gaze toward Seon-ho, who had watched the entire scene with a quiet, observant maturity. The boy didn't look afraid. He looked as if he were taking notes on how a king deals with a traitor. Do Hyun, Musang rasped, his hand trembling as he reached toward his eldest son. Obioma, come here. They approached the head of the table. The patriarch looked at Obioma, his eyes wet with the weight of a decade's worth of regret. I cannot give you back the years, he whispered. I cannot give you back the nights you spent in the cold, but I can give you the truth. The ledger is clear. The debt is settled. He looked at Seonho and then at Du Hyein. The main house is dead. Long live the shadow heir. Museng closed his eyes, his breathing becoming shallow as the adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade. He had settled his accounts. He had seen the woman who rebuilt what he had tried to destroy. And he had seen the boy who would carry the flame into a new century. Obioma felt Du Hyen's hand tighten on hers. The ledger of lies was closed. And as the family began to murmur in hushed, fearful tones, she knew that the era of the parks was over. The era of the bells had begun. The heavy oak doors of the park mansion closed behind them for the last time. The sound no longer a violent exclusion, but a final, resonant punctuation mark. The evening air of Seoul was cool and carried the scent of rain-washed stone and pine. It was a different air than the one Obioma had breathed. -1 years ago it no longer felt like a weight, but like an invitation. Obioma walked down the marble steps with a measured, graceful stride, her cream blazer catching the moonlight. On one side, Du Hyein moved with the liquid, predatory grace of a man who had reclaimed his birthright, only to realize he no longer needed it to be powerful. On her other side, Seonho walked with a small, sturdy dignity, his hand tucked firmly into hers. He didn't look back at the looming silhouette of the house. His eyes were fixed on the horizon where the city lights flickered like fallen stars. They reached the sedan, but before stepping inside, Obioma paused. She turned to look at the estate one last time. The windows of the dining hall were still glowing, but the light seemed dim, flickering like a candle in a drafty room. Inside, a dynasty was gasping its last breath, struggling to reconcile its ancient pride with the new reality she had delivered. Museng's regret, Seoyen's hollowed gaze, and the empty chair where a coward once sat, it was all a museum now. A relic of a world that thrived on shadows, finally brought into the sun. Du Hyein placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and steady. It's over, Obioma, he said softly, his voice a low vibrato that resonated in the quiet night. The debt is paid. The ledger is closed. I know, she replied, a faint, serene smile touching her lips. I just wanted to see it from the outside, to remember that the gates only have power if you're waiting for them to open. We've built our own gates now. They settled into the plush interior of the car. As the engine hummed to life and the tires began to crunch over the gravel, the mansion receded into the darkness of the trees. Seonho leaned his head against Obioma's arm, his eyes heavy with the exhaustion of a long day of being a king. Obioma reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. The screen glowed, illuminating the sharp, beautiful lines of her face. She navigated through her contacts until she found a name that had once been a source of agonizing pain, then a focus of cold ambition, and finally, a symbol of a life she had outgrown. Park Jae-yoon. She stared at the name for a moment. She thought of the rain-slicked driveway, the suitcase bursting open, and the way he had stood behind his mother's shoulder, a shadow of a man. She thought of the mottled purple of his face in the dining hall as the truth stripped him bare. There was no anger left in her, no desire for more blood, no need for further reckoning. Vengeance was a heavy burden, and she was finished carrying it. Her thumb hovered over the screen. With a single, decisive motion, she hit delete. The phone asked for confirmation. She gave it without hesitation. The name vanished. The digital ghost was gone, erased as thoroughly as the man had been from the family records. She felt a physical shift within her chest, a settling of bones, a deepening of breath. The temporary mistake had finally been corrected, but not by the Parks. It had been corrected by the woman who had transformed her brokenness into an empire. She slid the phone back into her bag and looked out the window. The car passed through the iron gates, which stood open and silent. They were no longer the boundaries of her world. They were merely the exit from a story she had finished writing. Du Hyein reached over, interlacing his fingers with hers. Where to now? He asked, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the dashboard. Obioma looked at her husband, the man who had seen her fire when she was only ashes, and then at her son, who was the living proof that love could rewrite a legacy. Home, she said, her voice clear and filled with a quiet, lethal peace. Let's go home. as the sedan merged into the flow of traffic, disappearing into the neon brilliance of a new dawn. Obioma leaned back and closed her eyes. The storm had passed, the reckoning was complete, and for the first time in 8 years, the silence was finally her own. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Your feedback truly matters and helps shape future content. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.